Good evening, everybody. Good morning or good noon for our distinguished guest at the other end of the Atlantic. Welcome to a webinar of the Institute for Israeli Thought. In the last couple of years, Israel has been experiencing a ferocious struggle over its democracy. The newborn extreme right government has proposed recently a series of fundamental legislations aiming at removing constitutional means of checks and balances, transforming Israel from an almost constitutional democracy into what one may call a non-liberal democracy. To cope with this transition, we organized a webinar to see what is to be done in face of this predicament. Without further ado, I would like to pass the lead to Dr. Tamar Hostovsky-Brandes, a senior fellow at the Institute for Israeli Thought, a faculty member at the Law School of Ono Academic College, and a leading constitutional scholar. Tamar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be short. We're not gathered here to hear me or Ronit. We're actually gathered here to hear our very distinguished guest. We have two very distinguished guests to give us insights, comparative insights into the issues and problems we're all very much concerned about, we're all very much worried about. Our first speaker will be Dr. Andras L, who I'm very happy to hold here, and he's a colleague and a friend. Thank you for joining us. Andras is a research professor and head of Department for Constitutional and Administrative Law at the Etovos. Oh, you have to help me here with the name, Andras. Formerly Hungarian Academy of Science, formerly known as the Hungarian Academy of Science Center for Social Science Institute for Legal Studies. And he has written extensively on various topics regarding nationalism, constitutional law, and also in recent years about democratic decline in Hungary and academic freedom, which is a topic that many of the participants in this webinar and attendees are very much concerned about. Andras, the floor is yours. We have up to 20 minutes, please.
Thank you, Tamar. Thank you so much. And I am really humbled by this invitation. I was actually it's a very short time we organized this, but I was actually very, very excited, and I've prepared with some very, I don't know how coherent notes I've been taking, and I've actually just asked what the title of the webinar is, because I only saw the Hebrew sign, so I hope I am not going to be committing consumer fraud in terms of providing a different product than what you signed up for. I am going to talk about Hungary, which, I guess is a point of comparison. Preferably not a point of reference for what I see, what is going on in Israel. And I'm also particularly humbled by this invitation, not only because of the large number of attendees, but also because of I understand the gravity, and I understand how I am really humbled by the fact that you guys have turned to me in a time of alarm, in a time of serious concern. So about for positionality, I am a comparative constitutional lawyer. I am a great enthusiast for Israeli constitutional law, but I have very superficial actual knowledge. There's some issues, constitutional identity, and some issues that I have been reading about. But for the rest, what I know about the Israeli case is an interested news reader. I obviously have been following the developments as an outsider, but maybe my perspective, talking from a self-proclaimed illiberal democracy, and also this bird eyes perspective, maybe of some use. I hope. The other reason why, in the past 13 years that Hungary has stepped foot on the path of illiberalism, I have been to countless meetings and discussions and seminars and webinars and talking, and so Hungary has been a pioneer in discussions about populism and illiberalism, and one of the reasons why these discussions have been organized is because autocracies, politicians, legislators, spin doctors learn from each other. this is an obvious fact, and I believe the reason behind this webinar and this discussion, that again I don't intend to talk a lot. I'm much more interested, and I hope that you also would profit more from questions and discussions, is that so should the resistance. This is something that stakeholders on the other hand could also be learning from each other. Let me talk a little bit about Hungary first. The Hungarian path for liberalism has been officially now been stepping into its 13th year. This is a country with constitutional state capture. I think it has been widely documented. The regime, the government that has been constantly in power with a 2/3 supermajority in parliament, has basically rewritten the entire constitutional, and not only constitutional, the entire legal landscape, has adopted a new constitution, and has basically captured all independent or semi-independent, and all organs had basically fallen captive to this government. So local governments have basically been deprived from a lot of their legal and constitutional powers, but also their financial means. We see the media practically either by taking over the public media, but also through the corruption that has been a critical element of this regime. Also, the oligarchized private media has basically been in the hands of the government. The judiciary, the educational sector, be it higher education or the entire public educational sector, through basically controlling the curriculum as well as the funding and the actual control of public educational institutions, the business sector, the electoral role. So basically all facets of life one can think of. Hungary and Poland have been, hand in hand in some of these processes. As you may know, the European Union has actually, for the first time in its history, has initiated a rule of law conditionality mechanism. And in the last stage of this, or up to now, the last stage of this debate, a couple of weeks ago, the European Parliament, in its report, has actually claimed that Hungary is no longer a pure democracy. It is what can be called a hybrid regime. So these developments has actually brought Hungary fame, a dubious one, but certainly Hungary has become known way beyond its political or economic influence. I would just always recall this. We were going to a conference, JFK Airport. We're going for a conference, and the immigration officer says, "Okay, what kind of conference are you going to?" Well, so what not? And then his eyes brighten up, and yes, Viktor Orbán. Right. So when would the Prime Minister of Hungary be known to an immigration officer at an American airport? So Hungary. Usually I have this kind of unease of what can be relevant that comes from Hungary. I think or what lessons can be relevant. First, what I think what I should start by saying is that Hungary is misleading. If you look at Hungary, it's a peaceful country. Its prime minister has been elected for the 4th time now with a 2/3 majority without actually harsh or obvious interferences with the elections. Even the OSCE in the last elections in 2022 said that these were fair elections, legally speaking, although there were free elections, but were not fair because the media imbalance, etc. But it's no one actually. This is not Turkey. This is not Russia. We don't see opposition politicians being poisoned or falling out of high-rise buildings. We don't see opposition politicians or human rights defenders imprisoned, but it is a scary place. It is an insecure and a scary place for academics. It's a scary place for entrepreneurs, for opposition politicians, for teachers, for nurses. And also, it's a very scary place for patients. If you end up in a Hungarian public hospital, it's also a scary place for people who are not yet pensioners, because there's not going to be pensions. It's also a very scary place, apparently, for students. And even more so, it's a very scary place for parents who have kids who are likely to leave the country. Nowadays, it's part of the middle class intellectual project that it's not a question that your children should not be, not only it's that they should not be going to universities in Hungary, which would seem nice, but it's the fact that they should not be returning to this country. So it is an unpleasant and a somewhat of a scary place for patriotic intellectuals. The Hungarian case, turning to some of the legal aspects of what's going on, from a legal point of view, Hungary is the case study for what is called, and I think it's interesting when lawyers and constitutional lawyers talk about what's happening. It has been a case for what is called abusive constitutionalism. So this is one of, I think, the most striking case for regimes that institutionalize authoritarian enclaves or bionic appointments. We have all of these definitions coming on. So basically the idea is that the vocabulary and the imagination of a constitutional democracy is being hijacked, and we see abusive constitutional borrowing from the global constitutional canon. This is what Professor Scheppele coming after me. This is something I always cite. I think this is a brilliant term she used in one of the early assessments of her on this country is the Franken state. So this is, you have legislators, you have codifiers stitching together perfectly normal rules, normal institutions from laws of various exemplary democracies, EU member states, etc., into a monstrous new whole. So abusing constitutional, abusing the rule of law, and using a cynical legal debate whenever it comes up, either at international fora, in the case of Hungary in the EU, but also in other institutions, and also to a limited degree in domestic constitutional law fora, right? I have to say that there is less and less of a need for that in this country because there is less and less of a need to have debates because of this. I will come back to that in a bit, because of the state of the opposition and because of the state of the political discussion and electorate. So I have 2 points that maybe I think can be useful, and I think are useful in discussions in this field. And one pertains to terminology. I mean, this is what academics do is we classify, we differentiate, we analyze, we come up with concepts. We use all sorts of terms: autocracies, illiberal regimes, dictators. There's a long list of semi-synonymous terms that are being used. And I guess one of my questions to you would be, what is the best term how you would describe the Israeli situation? So terms, by the way, are illuminating, but they also are often misleading and somewhat irrelevant. I think, the starting point is that people who engage in these discussions have a firm understanding and belief that something is deeply wrong, coming from the standards of constitutional democracy. But I think it also has a very wide degree of actual problems that might differ country by country. So is it institutions are we talking about? Are these meta-institutional issues that we talk about? And if these are institutions, what kind of institutions are at the core of the discussions? Is it judicial independence? This is obviously something that triggers our discussions today in Israel. Is it academic freedom? Is it due process? Is it constitutional identity? Is it minority rights? My point I'm trying to make is that, but while it is true, and this is what I started with, that autocrats learn from each other, both successes and failures, whether these are political, legal, or other. But comparisons are often superfluous. This has been my experience. So as stimulating and of course as depressing these discussions there are, I think this. Although both, say, Israel, Poland, and Hungary will have stories and histories about curtailing judicial independence, but the differences, I argue, are more numerous and more relevant than the similarities within these countries, which will, the consequences of which will be that, yes, I mean, it's important that we talk to each other and we share I think it already helps or fear of I guess anxiety. But I guess the lessons are much more difficult to decipher. Let me just come to the case jump back to the case of Hungary. Hungary and Poland have been sort of used as sort of twins in this processes. Partly because both Hungary and Poland are now targeted by the rule of law conditionality procedures. But I tend to subscribe to those who claim that Hungary is much more much more different than actually alike Poland. Unlike Poland, where I think the illiberal turn or the illiberal trends are actually triggered by truly held ideological beliefs. A lot of people argue, and I think convincingly, that Hungary is a kleptocracy. There is no real ideology. This is only about political power and oligarchical economy. It is how EU funds and certain multinational companies can feed into this political regime. And I think this is going to, and I'll come back to this in a bit, although I know my time is shortly up, that this is going to be very, very important. Just, ironically today, as I was I was working out in a gym, I was listening to a podcast from Yuval Harari, and basically he was making this well-known claim that democracy is not possible everywhere. You actually need to have very specific conditions for democracies to even be able to exist. And now this is what I think. So from this bird's eye perspective that I have on Israel is that it's actually quite counterintuitive that Israel had actually always been a unique but true democracy. But I also have to say that, and again, this points to how different democracies are and how different autocracies are, if they spark up, is that, well, for example, as for at least my perspective, Israeli democracy, which again, I think is I see as a resilient and a respectable one, is actually, strictly speaking, filled with institutions that are actually otherwise incompatible with mainstream constitutional democracy. This is, a democracy while being a theocracy. This is a democracy by being partly an ethnocracy. This is a democracy basically a permanent state of quasi-emergency of military, powers, which, for example, have the way the media and national security censorship work. So these are, if you were to take these institutions in an isolated form, you would say, okay, these are incompatible with democracy. So actually, what makes, from my again, bird's eyes view, Israel a resilient democracy may actually have the answer to what can be done, if it is actually weakened by certain elements. In order to, and I will finish shortly, in order to maybe, facilitate this discussion, I'm just going to have 4 saddening facts from Hungary that hopefully, you guys will not be, and I think you guys will not be seeing. And one is demography. And I know, of course, it is a core element in Israel with Haredi and Palestinian, but for democracy, Orban has, for at least for the past, I would say 8 years, but one can even argue that even, for the entirety of its regime, had about 25% of the electorate voting for him. It has been, the electoral, law has been changed. There is gerrymandering going on, but it's still within the limits of constitutionally acceptable, and this is something that has been tolerated by international democracy watchdog organizations. So this 25% of the electorate has been enough for this, obviously highly talented and charismatic political leader to create a 2/3 parliamentary majority in, again, free, unfair, but free elections. So if you think you have a demographic problem, you can have way less complicated countries and having very severe, political problems coming out of this. The other is time. I think. The Orban regime has been now in power for 13 years. Not only is it the case that the students I teach have basically not lived their conscious life in any other regime than this. If we compare the communist regime, Hungarian communist regime, the communist constitutional takeover in Hungary happened in 1949. If you add 13 years to that, we're at 1968. Now, Stalin died in 1953, so actually only 4 years after the communist takeover in Hungary. We had the 1956 revolution, which had basically 1 year of a very harsh oppression after that. But ever since then, the regime consolidated itself, and there was a slow but constant move to exit. Well, now in Hungary, we see no signs of this at all. Okay, the regime is highly unlikely to change at all. The impression we just had elections last year. The impression is that if it's ever going to change, it's not going to be by elections. The opposition lacks the charisma, lacks all the features to offer a feasible alternative. There are no unions. There's no civil resistance. We have a couple of spectacular cases of public protests against certain issues. Mostly they are related to the educational sector. We had 100,000 people protesting against the expelling the Central European University. We had very spectacular protests, but then they all sort of sank into oblivion, as if they had never happened. Basically, these 13 years have been enough for the entire parliamentarism to fade out. There are debates in parliament, but it's because of the 13 years of 2/3 majority. These are basically completely irrelevant. We had an interesting discussion. There was also sort of an international discussion in the first part of 2022, again triggered by Hungary. Is that okay? How can regimes? How can constitutional restoration? How do you restore a constitutional regime, if at all, if it ever happens? Well, I mean, at this point, it's. Speaking from Hungary, these are hardly unlikely scenario. The other two lessons, and I'm going to be very brief, is I mentioned briefly that basically the entire media has been taken over by the government, both public and much of the commercial, and including the freely delivered tabloid media. So this basically what has shown that even though, of course, the internet is free and people live in social media bubbles, this does not really translate to a resilient, democratic, opposition in any way. And the last point I think that Hungary teaches is that while the global academic, especially the legal academic elite has we've always been looking at multi-level constitutionalism as a safeguard, as setting the boundaries which cannot be crossed, and it's the results are fairly disappointing, even though the EU has actually been progressing in a direction that was not, foreseeable a couple of years ago that it would ever happen. They would have a conditionality, a rule of law conditionality provision, etc. But the US, the EU, international law will not make the changes for Hungary, and this is the lesson that we are seeing. Of course, a victory at the European Court of Human Rights, can be an empowering, can be empowering for short term for legal academics and human rights defenders. And NGO activists, but its impact is very limited. I have a number of issues. I have a number of cases which I think how Israel is different from Hungary, which is a more I would say on a more optimistic note. But I think I'll leave those to the Q&A part of this session. I hope I haven't abused my time too much.
We will look for those more optimistic notes, Andras, during the Q&A. Thank you very, very much. That was very insightful. And we will wait for, we're looking forward. I'm sure people will have a lot of questions. Our next speaker is Professor Kim Lane Scheppele. Professor Scheppele is the Lawrence S. Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs in the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs and the University Center for Human Values at Princeton University. And Professor Scheppele works at the intersection of constitutional and international law and is perhaps the most prominent expert in the world on the questions that we're interested in: democratic decline, populist constitutionalism, and the processes that we are looking into. Professor Scheppele, I'm turning to you. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks also to Andras for saying so much about Hungary that I don't have to. Usually I'm the one who comes to talk about Hungary, but I want to talk a little more generally about the role of courts in a democracy, because what brings us here is, of course, this latest set of proposals from the Israeli government to radically change the role of the Supreme Court in the context of Israeli politics. And when I first heard that, I was reminded of what happened at the very beginning when Viktor Orban came to power, and then when the Law and Justice government in Poland came to power. The first thing they did was to attack the judiciary, and in particular to attack the High Court. So within a month or two of taking office in 2010, Viktor Orban changed the system through which the judges on the Constitutional Court were appointed. And it was a small technical change that was very hard to explain to the public as a whole. But the effect of it was to remove any constructive role of the opposition in appointing judges. Viktor Orban then expanded the number of judges on the court, giving himself more seats to fill. And part of the argument for expanding the number of judges on the court was that the country was going to write a new constitution. And one of the things that was under discussion was the possibility of creating a German-style constitutional complaint. You know, an individual could take a case involving their own personal rights to the Constitutional Court, something that hadn't been part of the court's jurisprudence before, and under the guise of improving the condition for human rights. This was going to add a lot more caseload to the Constitutional Court, and that became the reason for adding seats. Okay. So I mention these things for a couple of reasons. One is that the way judicial reform comes and the way it's justified may not be what it's actually doing in the system. Orban wanted to capture the Constitutional Court, and those were the rationales he gave. And to an outside audience, you know, one was a very technical question about appointing the judges, and what Viktor Orban always said was, you know, that in the German system, you only need a simple two-thirds vote of the parliament to nominate a constitutional judge. That's what we have in Hungary, okay? And then with regard to, you know, expanding the jurisdiction of the court to give it more cases, to provide a rationale for then packing it with more judges, that had just been done in Turkey the year before. And, you know, observers were divided, but there were lots of human rights advocates who thought this was an improvement, okay? So I mention this to say exactly what Andras said. Autocrats in training learn from each other, and they look around and they see what other potential autocrats have gotten away with. And then they import those ideas back into their own system. And so, but they often import those things back into their own systems in a way that has a different effect, you know. And so Andras mentioned some of my work on the Frankenstate. The metaphor is obviously, you know, Frankenstein's monster. How was he created? You know, Dr. Frankenstein goes out and digs up all these once normal bodies and then attaches the torso of one to the arm of another, to the leg of another, and then this creates the monster, right? So you can do that in law, just as you can do it in this novel. And the idea is that you take what look like perfectly normal laws from different countries, import them into a different context, and then justify them by saying, look, ex-normal democracy has this rule, but then in the context in which you've imported it, it has a completely different effect. Okay, so this, in order to kind of fight this, because the point of this is to say what can be done, right? So I think we've learned some lessons by watching some of these other autocrats take over and really destroy their democracies in plain sight, all the while, and this is kind of the the charming and terrifying thing to those of us who teach comparative constitutional law. Autocrats have become really good comparative constitutional lawyers. You know, they look around, they scan the horizon for useful tools in various, you know, upstanding democracies that can be brought home and misused in the current context. So what can we do? Well, part of, I think, what needs to be said is that when you look at the role, particularly of a judiciary in a democracy, because this is the current situation, the question isn't how should a judiciary be designed all by itself. The question is, what's the role of the judiciary in the constitutional system as a whole? So let me just give you some possibilities. So in some countries that have weaker judicial review than Israel presently has, there are things like a bicameral parliament. So there's a kind of check in the parliamentary process, which doesn't automatically mean that the decisions of one chamber automatically become law. So a bicameral parliament's a check. A presidential system, which Israel has tried in its recent past, is also a check because you have multiple elections and different electoral majorities standing behind and different legal officials who can then check each other's decisions. Embeddedness in an international framework, you know, to what extent is the government bound by international obligations under either human rights agreements or other things to behave itself, and are there international checking mechanisms? And of course, the question is there a written and entrenched constitution? All of these things act as checks in the system, you know, and so one of the interesting and alarming things to me about what's happening in Israel now is how few of those other checks are present in the system. Basically, what you've got in Israel is a court that bears much of the weight of the checking power on government. When you have, as in Hungary, as in Israel, a unicameral parliamentary system where the government of the day is guaranteed a majority, then you need some check on that system to prevent that majority from running away with what might have otherwise been constitutional protections. So what are constitutional protections? What do we worry about with respect to a captured judiciary? Well, the first thing you worry about is unchecked executive power. And much of what the structural provisions of, you know, single text written constitutions are about are trying to provide some way, some check, so that the executive doesn't just run wild with the power that the executive has. So the question is, you know, if the court is going to be cut back, what are the other checks, right? So in thinking about what you can do, think about looking creatively at other constitutional systems and ask if there are substitutes. The other thing that courts do is to protect the rights of ethnic, racial, religious, or political minorities. Because what democracy is about is not just that the current majority gets its way on everything, right? What a democracy is about, I always say, is not the last election, but the next one, right? Can you get to the next election and have a free and fair election with open competition? And in order to get there, what you need is a current government that is not so hobbling the political opposition, not so hobbling, you know, the minorities who might get crushed in the way of majoritarian policymaking. You need some institution that stands up to the present government that lets the next election be free and fair. All right, so what about courts? Now, what we've seen in declining democracies around the world is that the autocrats, the aspirational autocrats, in fact, I'm almost thinking that when somebody comes to power and does these things, you should just assume they're going to be an aspirational autocrat because they all follow the same first step. So the first thing the autocrats do is they try to change the judicial appointment system to make it more political. And that has happened in Hungary. One of the reforms that came about right with the new constitution at the end of 2011, beginning of 2012, was the creation of a new office that basically had one person appointing, hiring, firing, removing, disciplining, you know, reassigning judges. All of the power was concentrated in the hands of somebody who was nominally a judge, but who, in addition to being the wife of the chief guy who wrote the Constitution, was also herself very implicated in the inner circle of the political party that has been governing Hungary since 2010. So politicization of judicial appointments. This has happened immensely in Poland, where in addition to politicizing the appointment of Supreme Court or Constitutional Court judges, they've now taken over something called the National Council of the Judiciary, which is the appointment body of judges. And that appointment body used to have a majority of its members selected by the judiciary and very few members selected by the president or the parliament. And now almost all the members of that body are selected by the president or the parliament, all of which now have a kind of hardwired majority in favor of the ruling party. So the politicization of judicial appointments is exactly what happens when autocrats try to take over the courts. Then they try to find ways to ignore adverse decisions, because oftentimes while the courts are being packed, they'll be very brave. I mean, they know what their job is, and they will often stand up to a government trying to curtail their constitutional powers. So then the question is, how do the autocrats ignore these decisions? So in Hungary, the way that that happened was that as the court was being packed, it was actually declaring a lot of laws unconstitutional, first under the old, then under the new constitution. And right when the court was finally packed, right when Viktor Orban got his majority on the court, the government pushed through this constitutional amendment that was half as long as the Constitution itself, putting into the Constitution directly all of the laws that had been declared unconstitutional by the Constitutional Court. And part of that amendment said the Constitutional Court may not review constitutional amendments for their constitutionality. So they just overrode all of those decisions. In Poland, it was a little different. There, the court, the Constitutional Court was resisting being packed. It was issuing a lot of decisions. And according to Polish law, decisions only take effect when they are published in the official gazette, right? The official publication of the Polish government, which it turns out was not published by the court itself, but was published by the parliament. And so the government just ordered the parliament not to publish the decisions. And so they were not published. And then the Constitutional Court, in its method of resistance, published the decisions on its website. So when you went to the court's front page, all you saw were their decisions standing up to the government. And this was actually really effective because what it did, and it published them in English, that's the other thing. It published them in an international language. It made them very accessible to outside monitors. And it was really a cry for help from the court, which let everybody know, that they were captured. The other thing the court did was to refuse to publish on its website, which was within its control, the names of what they called fake judges, the judges who were appointed in a compromised political process. So if you went and you looked at the list of judges on the court, you couldn't see who the judges were. So then the parliament fought back. The parliament then said, okay, well, in order to declare a law unconstitutional, what you have to do is to have a supermajority of judges on the court. Never mind that the Constitution itself said the court decides by a simple majority. Parliament passed a law that said, well, now you need 2/3 of the judges to make a ruling. And the only way you could get 2/3 was to have on that panel some of the judges that had been these fake judges appointed by the government. So there was a big back and forth. But what was crucial was they took the stuff out of Polish into English, which is to say they put it in an international language where they could start drumming up support from the European Commission, from the Council of Europe. The second thing was that there were protests at every decision. And there was, in fact, you can look on the web, if you Google notes from Poland, they started a website where constitutional lawyers would say, again, in English, and then there was one also in German, here's what's going on. Here's our analysis of every decision coming out. So the crucial thing is to make visible how the court is packed and what kinds of decisions it's making. So, all of that, I think, really made a huge difference. Let me say a couple things about what else I think people can do. So there's now a wonderful new book just out by Laura Gamboa called Resisting Backsliding. And it's a study of Colombia and Brazil. And one of the things that she shows is that the way that you fight off autocratic capture is to act early. once this stuff becomes law, once it becomes entrenched, once everybody starts to take it for granted and orient their behavior around it, it's too late. So early action is absolutely crucial to prevent autocratic measures from being entrenched. The next thing, acting together. So one thing that keeps certainly we saw this in Hungary, and it's been a bit better in Poland, but we see it also in the United States as we've had some of these issues here as well. There's a problem organizing the entire opposition to act in unison. Now, some of that is because when attacks come from the right, the left is absolutely expert at splitting and creating circular firing squads, right? This is what the left specializes in. This is a moment where you have to say, we're going to take the people who are now homeless from conservative parties that no longer respect the rule of law and they've left. We need to take them on board. We need to unify everybody who's opposed to the changes. So you create a democracy coalition where you may disagree completely with the people you're marching next to or petitioning with or acting together with about every other issue in politics. But democracy and judicial independence have to come first before you do anything else. So in the US, I'm working on this. It's a bit of a struggle here, but you have to unite the opposition. This happened actually in the last election in Hungary. Turned out not to be as effective as it might have been, in part because I think, well, anyway, we can go on about why. Some of it, a lot of it was the government's fault and not the opposition's fault. But unless you have a united front prioritizing democracy and the rule of law, it'll never work. And then I think, and this is one of the lessons I think where Poland did much better in Hungary than Hungary in this regard, mark the changes. So if these reforms go through, if you start getting politicized judges on the bench, just call them fake judges every time you write about them. Some people in Poland call them pseudo judges, but just they should be walking around with a little mark on their heads that say, a little mark that says, I was not properly appointed. And every time those judges issue decisions, point out, how many of the politically appointed judges were on the case. This has had this immense benefit. What's happened in Poland now, since all the fake judges are marked and all their decisions are marked, the Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, starting with something called the zero floor decision, XEROFLOR decision, the zero floor decision said any collective decision by a court which has improperly appointed judges on it must be nullified. They reached that decision a year and a half ago, and there's a whole string of other Polish cases coming up through the courts. In that case, it was a decision of the Constitutional Court, which had on it 3 members that had been appointed in violation of the law at the time. And the European Court of Human Rights is now working its way through all of these captured Polish courts and basically saying the decisions must be nullified if there's even one judge on the panel that was improperly appointed. So marking the judges and pointing out exactly what effect they have has been very effective in bringing around the European Court of Human Rights. Finally, I wanted to say one thing on judicial overrides, because I know this is one of the topics in Israel. And when I heard that, I thought, oh no. And the reason why is that the Canadian judicial override is fairly famous. This is where the court makes a decision involving they're all Charter of Human Rights decisions, the charter rights in the Canadian system. Not all rights can be overridden in this way, but a certain number of rights, if the court makes a decision that goes farther than the parliament wants, and this is true both of the national parliament and of the provincial parliaments, then the parliament can reenact the law, saying, we reenact this law notwithstanding the fact that the court has held this violates charter rights. And then if that is done, the law can last for 5 years at max before it expires. The idea is that you get to the next election, and if that limitation on rights is unpopular, then people can throw the bums out. That's the basic argument. Okay. Now, I actually recently advocated an override system for the US. And the reason why I did that is because, as you all know, what I always find is that my colleagues, my Israeli colleagues who do constitutional law know US constitutional law better than most American lawyers. So I won't explain it all to all of you. But what's been happening, of course, in the US is that the Supreme Court has now been politically captured. And the reason why it's been politically captured is because there has been this drive by one political party to get its nominees onto the court, including bending all of the rules to get them there. Now, the reason why the court was captured was because the US has an impossible to amend constitution. So when the court makes a decision, the only way around it, really, practically speaking, is to capture the court. That's why all the energies went that way. And so one of the things I've advocated is developing an override, not by simple majority, by the way, but a sort of 2/3 override, equivalent to the US override of a presidential veto. Because if there's a political solution to an overreaching Supreme Court decision, this way you can channel the anger back into politics and not direct it at the court. Okay, but let me just say something about my Franken-State analysis to conclude. The reason why the override works in Canada is because there was originally parliamentary supremacy. These rights were overlaid on that. And early on in the use of the override clause, there was a kind of public shaming of the parliaments that did that. I'm not so sure that's holding now. It's actually a bit falling apart in Canada. But the reason for advocating it in the US is if you have an impossible to amend constitution and a powerful court, unless you have some override mechanism, all the anger gets directed at the court and the pressures to pack the court become extreme. Israel has none of this, right? This goes back to you have to analyze all of this in context. Not only does Israel not have an impossible to amend constitution, it has only a partial constitution, right? So, I mean, in terms of single written text or a multiple, enactment written text. And so there's absolutely no need for an override where Parliament already has the powers that it has, right? So I guess what I want to say in all of this is that it's important whenever something is pulled off the rack from some other constitutional system to ask yourself, does it actually work as advertised in that system? And if so, what does it depend on in that system? And do we have those elements of the system in the one to which it might be imported, right? Because what we're seeing, and this goes back to what Andras said in his comments, all of the aspirational autocrats learn from each other. And what's so striking about this wave of autocracy is that the aspirational autocrats are elected, usually in free and fair elections the first time, and they operate by law. They get elected and they change the law. That's what's supposed to happen in a democracy. And it throws people off base because they say, well, we lost the election, what can you expect? But this is where you have to ask, do you have a framework within which executive power can be checked, minority rights can be defended? Doesn't have to happen in, there's a million ways you can do that. But if the institutions that have been responsible for those things in your own constitutional system have come under attack, it's important to act early, act together, mark the changes, and don't give up. So thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there are a million questions. I'm going to open the floor. Attendee, can you raise your hand? If you can raise your hand, then I'm just going to open the mic. I see we do have 2 questions in the chat, although I'd rather open the mic for you to hold the discussion. I'm just going to read the questions that are already written. Roy Davidson, Andras, if you could say a little more about how Hungary is scary for entrepreneurs nowadays. And Nikki Lax asks you if you can teach your students freely today, and how do you feel in Hungary? And I have to remind you that you promised us some optimism and points for what can be done and resistance. So you owe us also that. Eyal, I'm going to open your mic. Let me know if it works.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we're going to take a few questions, and then we're going to let you both answer, and then do a few rounds if that's okay. We can hear you.
Sure. So my question has to do with what we call here the elephant in the room. And Kim, thank you for the great lecture. Thanks both of you. And Kim, you talked about the fact that we need to unify around the question of democracy and judicial independence. But one of the things that I don't know if anyone has an answer for, but one of the challenges we've been seeing is that many of us think that democracy cannot live together with occupation of, over 50 years of billions of people living without any rights. And we see this split already, and we really see literally fights inside the demonstration with some people coming with anti-occupation slogans or even with Palestinian friends, and others saying you are destroying the battle because we want to, to so to say recruit even some right-wingers who are for democracy, and definitely centrists, but we are alienating them by coming with a Palestinian flag or with an anti-occupation. But on the other hand, the other people, like say the anti-occupation group said, it's for us it's hypocritical to go and stand in this demonstration where people talk about the democracy that we had and we are going to lose now because of Netanyahu, and the court, which was so great in protecting rights, whereas we think the court was not so great on Palestinian rights. And we definitely think there is going to be further deterioration for Palestinian rights and every right. But we want to say, and not just as a principled matter, but also maybe thinking forward that actually if we really want a deep change in this society, and we also have to tackle the issue of the occupation. And if we don't do this, we fail in a way because actually part of the reason for this backsliding is the wish to entrench the occupation and to undo some judgments which for Palestinian rights. So I think we have a really big problem here of being unified because of this split, which is essential. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but I think that's something, because everyone agrees, yes, we have to talk about democracy and judicial independence, but some people say for us, we cannot talk about democracy without bringing this literally to the demonstration, to the discussion, etc.
Thank you, Eyal. I'm just going to add in, and then we're going to a few short rounds, I think, rather than one long one. Well, first, I think, Ken, thank you for the presentation. We should have actually brought politicians to hear you say, the opposition politicians to hear you say that they need to unite. But if you could talk a little bit more about what the role of public and civil society is that has in this respect, if at all. And let's say 2 short rounds, maybe Andras, you want to start, and then back to you, Kim, and then we'll take a few more questions.
Thank you. Just a quick answer to the written question. So entrepreneurs are not in danger in the classic sense that the government will just freeze your bank accounts and take it over. But what actually happens, it's the cornerstone of the Orban regime, and this is why I say that it's a completely different story from Poland. I believe it's a completely different story from Israel, where you have ideologies and you have zealots who believe who see themselves as missionaries. I believe what's happening in Hungary, there is no ideological mission there. It is about money. I think this is one of the chief advisors to Orban for many years. He was the president of the leading business school in Hungary, said that, well, corruption is the means of operation. That's the essence of the Orban regime. So basically, the regime had, treats various, companies differently. It provides very generous support, both in terms of the tax environment, but also in actual cash flow to some multinational companies, German car industry, etc. It also ostracizes some companies, multinationals or not. Some retail companies, etc., are on the blacklist, and they will create tax and other, legislation that will be basically making their existence impossible. It will also be very favorable to create an oligarchic national, economic or entrepreneurial regime, and then the rest will be, in a very volatile situation. Again, not in a classic sense. They will not have their assets frozen and taken over by government. So this mafia, state operates in a more subtle way, but it still, is what it is. The very similar story applies for academic freedom. The question was, can I teach everything I can do a class? Yes, this is a hybrid regime. We do not have, academics, passports withdrawn. We don't have academics in prison. I have been, fired from one academic job. I still have, for the time being, a couple of other two. I never had any, I never had to watch, behind my back. But this does not apply for a junior academic. It will certainly not apply to everyone. Academic freedom is under very severe pressure, and the curriculum for public education has basically been, again, I think the effects of this cannot be overestimated. This is, there is an ideological state capture as well that's going on. As for positive things, and again, I may be wrong here, but and it's more a question than is. So my question is, do you think, having maybe not accepting, but having understood my take on Orban as opposed to Poland. So where do you see Israel? Do you actually see, where do you see the fundamental differences between, and again, I talked about the difficulty of the terminology we use. How, what do we talk about? Are we talking about left or right? Are we talking about, ultra orthodox? What are the terms that we're using? Do you think that you are still participants of the democratic game with your political opponents? Do you think that the right, and again, probably it's not a homogeneous, entity either. Are you guys playing the same game? And I see that, for example, that's also, when it comes to the US, what we actually see is that not only, I think, not playing the same game is that political rivals see the others as enemies and not as rivals, right? So I think it's a very important distinction, and this is what autocrats are happily engaging in. One thing, and the other thing is, do you see that's the other, I guess, sign for not being within the boundaries of the democratic game is accepting electoral defeat. Right? I mean, we see part of that. We not only see that in Brazil, we see that in the US as well. So I think it's, so my question is, can you foresee, or can you imagine the current government as being, patriots with a mission that, of course, you cannot accept and you don't, see as acceptable in any way, but it is something that is a sincerely held patriotic, whatever vision of, constitutional, political, whatever identity. I think this is the most important, question for me. A slight, positive differences, is, I think, economy matters. I think the fact that Israel is a high-tech, sustainable, economy, a successful economy. I think it's a very important feature here. Autocrats are always, or very, very often, heavily engaged in economic processes. And one last point is, again, I think, one of the big difference I see with certainly Hungary. I'm not even sure I can say it for the entire post-communist bloc, but for me, the big difference for many years was that in Western Europe, even though you can say Italian politics is a mess, there has always been a core, untouchable, a very resilient, left, right. You always had. Say, if it was a right-wing regime, you had the left there. It's the same in France. You have in Austria. Whatever happens on the right, there's always going to be a left. This is something that does not happen in Hungary. I think this is a problem with Hungary. No unions, no left. For me, from this bird's perspective, one of the strengths of Israel, I cannot imagine the evaporation of Israeli, of this, secular left wing, whatever Israeli opposition. Of course, the question of, how marginalized this gets, especially in the political field, that's another story. But I think these are very important features.
Thank you. Kim?
Yeah, so let me just say something about academic freedom in Hungary, and also to put András's position in some context. The university he's at is Ötvös Tudományegyetem. I can see why people can't say it, but his university is one of the very few in Hungary that has not been, as they put it, privatized. So this is, again, a legal trick. What the government did in the last couple of years was to create what they call, I guess the literal translation is public interest asset management foundations. They created these things, which are private law entities. And then in a couple of sessions of parliament, they transferred massive amounts of state property, buildings, land, faculty, curriculum, everything, libraries, into the hands of these private foundations. And then they put at the heads of these private foundations a kind of board of trustees that consists almost entirely of party loyalists. some of whom are actually government ministers. And the point of doing this was to actually take all of these universities out of, everything from public procurement rules to freedom of information rules. These trustees can dispose of the resources of these universities without any kind of public accountability. But crucially, what happened was that, Hungarian academics had tenure, I'm putting in quotes, by virtue of the fact that they were civil servants. And by moving them all now into this private foundation, they've all become at-will employees, which is to say they lost all the job security if they had any job security at all. And the government has now been sort of making moves toward actual repression. So Andras being in Elta is one of the few universities that wasn't so privatized. So it still has more independence. But a friend of mine who's chair of the constitutional law department at one of the universities that was privatized told me that he just got a notice that members and friends of the board are going to start sitting in on constitutional law classes to make sure that proper Hungarian law is taught, as opposed to like dissident constitutional law, which are all the decisions of the court before it was captured. Right? So it's starting to happen now where they're literally intrusions on classroom visits. And it's going to happen first in these privatized universities, and then it's going to come for the flagship universities. Also, I might say the EU, which caught on to the fact that all these privatized universities have no accountability for their use of public funds, has now refused to fund anything involving these universities. And that includes the Erasmus student exchanges. It includes Horizon research funding. All of that was just announced last week. So Hungarian universities are really in a bind. And, all those of you who can, protect Hungarian academics, I've been trying to find people jobs in other countries, like please do, because it's a really serious problem. This goes, and I'm going to get to Ayel's question last, but this goes to what Tamar was asking, what can civil society do? Well, one of the things, again, that we saw in Hungary, less so in Poland, but in Hungary, was that all the independent institutions were being compromised at once. So the universities were under attack. The civil sector organizations were under attack because they all got defunded. And then there was a law that required them to disclose their foreign funding. And then that law was changed to an annual state audit of all the NGOs. So in other words, and then there were, attacks on basically every single aspect of civil sector. There were the opening attack was actually on religious organizations. Hungary had something like 350 registered churches, as they call them. And the government basically canceled the organizational registration of all but 32 of them. So every single sector was under attack. And what happened was that everybody ran around protecting their sector and not joining forces, seeing this as a common plot, right? So everybody knows the first they came for the, this is what happens, right? And sometimes what happens in these autocracies is that they just blitz every institution at once. So it's absolutely crucial, again, to provide links from the civil sector to universities, to religious, especially minority religions, to human rights groups, to, just to kind of make a bond across all of these institutions, because you might be relieved that they don't come for you first. But, if the people who would defend you are the ones who were obliterated first, they're not around to defend you, right? So this really is across all of the institutions that can put up a resistance to an autocratizing regime. And you shouldn't assume it won't all happen and it won't all happen fast. I mean, so I think what's woken everybody up in Israel is this government is 2 weeks old? And already there's this. Okay, so you just don't know what other things they have in the pipeline. It's important to stay unified. Just on Ayel's question. So here's the hardest thing, especially for people who have a lot of human rights commitments. In other words, people who were discontent with whatever government they had before this one, right? Which is to say, there are a million fights that we need to fight in order to ensure that everyone has equal rights, just to take that one example, and that constitutional democracies survive. When you have a government that's really bent on shutting down the checks on its power, you literally have to put all the other issues second in order to do that first, right? And I say that because if you don't have a democratic government, if you're not capable of getting rid of them at the next election, if there are no checks on their power, you will never get anything else that you want to fight for, right? And that's where you have to form the biggest coalition, including with lots of people whose views you don't like, to do that first step. Because only if you have a democracy can you go back to the kinds of political arguments you were all having before when your democracy wasn't threatened. So it's a painful thing to do, to put important things second. But literally, you don't have anything unless you have a democratic government with checks on its power.
Thank you very much, Eva. And Ronit, you also wanted to ask? Eva, I'm opening your mic. Have I lose?
Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yeah. Now, I have a very short question, really. I was wondering, I mean, you started, both of you, talking about the process of imitation in a way. I was wondering if you could pinpoint who started it in a way. So that was my first question. Where does it start from, and how, I mean, and how did this chain of events take place? That was my first question. And the second is, how do you respond to the possible argument that the Chinese model is the one that is quietly winning the world? In other words, the idea that what citizens are aspiring to is security and financial prosperity or economic prosperity. And could it be that, in fact, there might be a shift in what citizens actually want? So, yeah, I'm sorry, this second question is not very well formulated, but I'm struck that I have not seen really a very solid response to that, to the Chinese justification and legitimation of their regime.
Ronit, you wanted to ask?
Yes, thank you both very much. My question to you, Professor Scheppele, is you noted that the changes are minor, even they seem to be irrelevant or just bureaucratic ones. But once they are imposed, they are very hard to turn over. The problem that we now observe is that in the public's eyes, some of the minor changes that the government seeks are actually considered welcomed, because there is much critique in Israel about the Supreme Court and about the Attorney General, and many politicians, even those that are now part of the opposition, are in favor of these changes. And what we think is that the question is not the particular change, but rather the overall picture. But now he says that it is a matter of the particular change. So it's not really a question, but just if you could clarify that for me and for the audience, how important it is to fight over really minor and bureaucratic changes in the context of them being imposed by a government who seeks an overall change in the system.
Can I answer these questions in reverse, because I also have a question for Eva. So in terms of Ronit, so I think yes, I mean, and this is why I keep saying you have to think of a constitutional system as a whole. When you change some little thing over here, it may affect other things over here, right? And you can be certain that the people wanting the changes have thought through all those implications. And if the opposition doesn't also think through those possibilities, you just get run over. So let me give you an example. When Viktor Orban first came to power, again, one of the first things he did was to get through the parliament a law to cut the size of the parliament in half. Okay, now this is a discussion that had been going on forever. Hungary had a parliament that was, 400 or so members. It's a tiny country. Do you need a parliament that's that big? It was expensive. They didn't have the offices. This had been something even the opposition had thought of at some point before then. So it hardly got any notice or any opposition. Okay. So it turns out people didn't think it through. So what happens when you cut the size of the parliament in half? The first thing that happened was Viktor Orban goes to all of his MPs and he basically says, look to the left, look to the right. Half of you will not be here. after the next election. And if you want to be nominated on a Fidesz party slate, you will vote for everything I put in front of you. Instant party discipline. Okay. Nobody thought about that when they were cutting the size of the parliament in half. The second thing is, okay, so you're going to cut the size of the parliament in half, and roughly half the seats in the Hungarian parliament are voted on in party lists, but the other half are single member districts. So you cut the size of the parliament in half, and somebody's got to draw all the lines for the new districts. Sure enough, Orban comes forward with a plan to gerrymander the entire country at once. He won 90+% of all the districts the first time out in the election. And this is why the system is rigged. Nobody can possibly win. You know, but again, it started with this completely unobjectionable to everyone thought that it would be, you don't need a parliament as big as they had, right? So I mentioned that in some detail because the question is, what are they doing and how does it ramify through the system? So, and it's important to, again, it's a constitutional system is a system. So what else does it affect? What else could it affect? And here's my problem. I'm looking at Andras. He lives in Hungary for real. I live in Hungary in my head, and Viktor Orban is like talking in my brain all the time. I've gotten to the point now where every time they propose something, I think of, what are they trying to do? What are the worst possible things? And I can often guess what they're going to do before they do it now, because if you follow them long enough, you realize that no change is innocent when they've already signaled that they will refuse to let go of power. Okay, and then you have to jump on every single thing, no matter how trivial. I know I've talked too much, but let me just say one thing in response to Eva. So I think that democracy takes a lot of work, right? It's not an easy system, and there are many people who would rather minimize their role. They would rather have security, prosperity, and all these things. Absolutely. But, I think I wouldn't wish this on anybody, but since it's happening, we might as well use it as an experiment. What's happening in China now? They have the zero COVID toleration policy, and then suddenly they lift all the restrictions. And they're saying, 60,000 people died in the first month. Okay, so this is what happens in dictatorships. You might have security and prosperity at the moment, but as soon as you get some autocratic leader who makes a decision, usually with imperfect information, because one of the things that happens in dictatorships is that they get worse and worse information the longer they go, because no one wants to stand up to the leader. And then it's over in a flash. Okay, so you have to just say, look at how actually existing dictatorships work. They might be fine in the short term, but long term, I worked in Russia after I worked in Hungary. And, war and economic collapse are at the end of dictatorships, one or the other. And, they don't end happily. So you have to preserve democracy.
Thank you.
System we know.
Two short questions. We have final time for two questions, and then Ronit's going to follow up. So Sandy, you're here, and Yael Berda, Sandy Kedar and Yael Berda, and then we're going to wrap things up. Sandy, you want to go first? But please, everyone, keep it short because we're already in terms of time.
Yes, thank you very much for these very interesting presentations. My question is about the role of the police and the army specifically, and the Treasury Department. As I see it, I think we're going to have a legitimacy clash between the Supreme Court and the Parliament and the government. And the question is, how can we try to get, or any way to get, to split the police, to split the Treasury, who's actually paying the salaries of all these persons? If there is any kind of insight of, was it ever attempted? That's my first question. And the second one is, can you expand a little bit more on where and when international pressure worked, if at all? Thank you.
Great questions, Yael.
Hi, thanks so much, Kim, for doing this session. I have a question that I keep asking myself. In Israel, there are the extent of emergency powers and the legitimacy to use them is much more than most countries. And one of the questions that which I don't understand is why the blitz? Like, what are they benefiting by doing this all at once? By this blitz of legislation, and also the threats of this. And I was wondering if you had an idea about it, given the fact that so much can be done through emergency powers and kind of going on the monkey bars from one set of laws to another.
Ronit, you wanted a short follow-up, and then I'm going to let you each final round of answers.
These were great questions. So I just want to really quickly ask you this. As a law professor, or as law professors, some of us have supported all kind of amendments over the years in our scholarship, as you just mentioned that you recently did with respect to the overriding clause. However, over time, under such extreme circumstances, what we once supported is now working against us. So as an academic, what should we do if we live under this concern?
Thank you. Maybe 5 minutes each, answer what you think is most important, most interesting, what you feel like answering. And then Ronit, you want to say some final words since we organize this together. And which one of you wants to go first? Andras, you want to go?
Sure, thank you. So many questions and great comments. Let me just maybe.
So you get to choose. Answer only what you want to answer.
Okay, well, a couple. One thing was that the written question was demonstrations. Are they still useful? I think demonstrations, of course, are wonderful. This is something. I, however, and this is my experience as a Hungarian observer, is I always thought that, if you go to a protest with 100,000 people for a cause, that cannot be, that your life has changed forever, right? You're never going to be the same person again. This will have an impact on you forever. One of the first universities they closed down was the University for Arts and Theater, and the students were actually for months being protectors of the university. They were standing guard in front of, at the university, windows and balconies. I thought, this will have a long-lasting impact on them, on their society, whatever. Not happening. The way Orban got into power in before 2010, they rioted the public TV, and said there was, the police was involved, and there was clashes with the police. I thought that this is going to change police corporate culture forever. This is a massive, unprecedented event in policing in Hungary, right? Nothing happened, right? So unfortunately, I would think that, this is the psychological and, political, it's not, I'm not sure how this works anymore. For international pressure, I think if you are engaged in abusive constitutional practices, international pressure is, it's a game you play. You actually even, enjoy playing it, but it can go wrong, right? We don't know what is going to happen with EU, money not flooding in at such a great, quantity as it has. It also touches on the question of what citizen wants. Of course, Orban, I think, is a brilliant, player, but it's not that difficult to be a brilliant, autocrat if you have incredible amount of money flooding in from multinational companies and the EU itself. Now, the situation might be changing now with the war going on, with economic crisis. Orban was extremely successful with paying everyone off, right? So if this is not the case, this is why I said that fact that Israel is a self-running economy, it does not rely on these kind of resources. You don't have to, make deals with Putin and whatnot. This is something that, that will that could have an impact at all. And finally, I think, one of the written questions said that the elephant in the room, what to be doing, what has, with occupation and Palestine. I mean, I think that is the elephant in the room. I think this is the core question that Israeli constitutional law, stakeholders haven't been able to deal with this issue. I mean, it is the Supreme Court. I mean, not this particular, as far as I know, that has basically said there is no such a thing as an Israeli nation that would include Palestinian citizens. It's a very complicated, unique, case, which I think Israel is. but this is, I think this as long as the elephant in the room is not being properly looked after, I think this is very difficult to move forward. And yeah, I don't unfortunately I don't have an advice for you on this end, except for that this is the main issue. Unless this gets resolved, I don't think there is a way to move forward.
Thank you. Andra. Kim.
Yeah, so many things to talk about. Let me start with emergency powers and Yael. And everyone should read Yael's new book, which started as a dissertation that I helped supervise. So I know all about it and it's great. All right, so on emergency powers. So obviously what they're aiming at now is not just a temporary suspension of rules. They're aiming at institutional capture, right? The thing about emergency powers is that you're basically still working through the same institutions, but in a kind of exceptional mode. This is really, these changes look to me like institutional capture. This is the time when we can finally kill off judicial review of what we're doing. What they're also doing, and this is what worries me, it's like that cutting the size of the parliament in half. It may look innocent, it may look like something people have been talking about forever, but if you think about the checks and balances in the Israeli system, there are very few, there's mostly the court. So therefore, attacking the court, it worries me because the question is, what happens when the court's out of the way, right? This is just the opening salvo. So this is about institutional change, and that's why I think you need to be especially worried. On the police, so this is where, again, civil society also needs to work with the police. Now, here again, how many of you personally know anyone in the police? And the answer is probably not, right? This is where you need friends and allies. The police have to be convinced that this is really an existential struggle for the future of democracy, and they should not be on the wrong side of it. Now, police in every country tend to come from the law and order, right wing, we'd love to knock heads sector of the society, right? They're not natural peacemakers. And so this is where, again, it will be really crucial to work with them and to try to figure out ways that, the police can be convinced that their future is with the civil society and not with these present, kind of exclusionary moves. On demonstrations. So demonstrations, I might disagree with Andras a bit. Demonstrations have not been used very effectively in Hungary, I think. They've been used really effectively in Poland, weirdly in Egypt and Pakistan. In those two countries, these, autocratic governments went after the high courts, and also in Poland. And people turned out en masse to protect the judiciary. It's different than having the people in an institution stand up for themselves with not enough other partners involved. That was the school that Andras mentioned. But a massive demonstration in favor of the judiciary has worked in a number of places. And I think it's crucial for everybody to realize that everyone has a stake in a free and fair judiciary, right? It's not just a niche issue. It's something everybody is affected by. And that brings me to the kind of international pressure. So I mentioned these decisions of the European Court of Human Rights. And of course, Israel's not bound by those decisions. On the other hand, Israel is an observer in the Council of Europe. And it seems to me that publicizing what these international standards are, it may not have binding legal effect, right? But it's something you teach your students if you're a law professor to say, here are the international standards. In fact, if it gets bad for academics, what you just say is, you say nothing, but here's how we do it. Here are the international standards, full stop. Let them do the comparison, right? But the fact that the European Court of Human Rights and the European Court of Justice are now elaborating standards for determining judicial independence ought to be of some help, if only to say, we're a second-class democracy if we don't follow these standards. And I think that might, be helpful. Let me just say something, because I didn't think I answered Ayel's earlier question about occupation. And of course, this is it's the reason why there's a lot of support for right-wing parties. It's the elephant in the room. It's not going to be solved just on the question of the independence of the Supreme Court. But the independence of the Supreme Court is going to be crucial to however it is solved, right? And that's why I'm just saying that, it's not that the occupation and its issues have gone away or become any easier. In fact, if anything, things look pretty dire on that score. But again, without an independent judiciary, you have no hope of solving the other problem. So you have to first work on the independent judiciary. I say with regret, right? Now, if you have enough people, you can try to work on everything at once, but it's absolutely crucial to ask yourself, will we be able to solve this problem over here without these institutions over here? And that's where the institutional change has got to be met with resistance. And your international friends can help, so international pressure. If I can do anything, let me know.
Thank you very, very much. Ronit, you want to say some final words very briefly?
As a matter of fact, I think all things that matter have already been said. I really appreciate both of you coming to speak to us. We had over 100 people as attendees in the crowd. We will use your inspiration and your understandings when we are facing such attempts, and it really brings me the belief that things can be done and changes to the right direction can be made. So thank you very much. And I invite everyone here to track the Israeli Forum of Legal Scholars. We are on the Twitter. We have a website. We will do everything we can together institutionally to influence those attacks on our democracy. So thank you very much.
Thank you both very, very much. And goodbye.
Thank you.
Best of luck. We'll be watching.
Thank you.